frozen breath of General George Washington mingled with the morning mist as he surveyed the Princeton Road on January 3, 1777. Behind him, 4,000 Continental soldiers marched through the bitter New Jersey winter, their footsteps leaving bloody prints in the snow. Most historians remember this as merely a follow-up to Trenton. They missed the profound truth. This single morning would determine whether the American Revolution survived its darkest hour, or died in the frozen fields of Princeton. Washington's army had been fleeing for months. After the disasters at Brooklyn Heights and White Plains, his force had dwindled from 20,000 to barely 3,000 desperate souls. The British controlled New York, the Hessians held New Jersey, and Congress had fled Philadelphia. In panic, even Washington's own generals whispered of surrender. The enlistments of most soldiers would expire at midnight on December 3, 1776, and few showed any inclination to re-enlist in what appeared to be a lost cause. But the surprise victory at Trenton 6 days earlier had sparked something unexpected hope. As Washington's men had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, striking the Hessian garrison at dawn, they had proved that the mighty British war machine could bleed. Yet one victory does not make a revolution, and Washington knew that without a follow-up success. Trenton would be remembered as nothing more than a desperate gambit by a dying rebellion. The intelligence reports were troubling. British Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood commanded nearly 1,000 seasoned regulars at Princeton, supported by artillery and protected by stone buildings that could serve as fortresses. These were not surprised Hessians sleeping off Christmas. Celebrations, these were battle-hardened British soldiers of the 17th and 55th Foot Regiments. Men who had fought across multiple continents for King George III. Washington's plan was audacious to the point of madness. Instead of retreating to winter quarters as any reasonable commander would do, he intended to march his exhausted army north from Trenton, strike Princeton at dawn, and then advance on the British stronghold at New Brunswick. His officers stared at him with a mixture of admiration and concern when he outlined the strategy. They had already achieved the impossible once, surely they should not tempt fate again. But Washington understood what his critics did not. The revolution hung by the thinnest of threads, and only through bold action could that thread be strengthened into a rope capable of bearing the weight of independence. The soldiers who had crossed the Delaware with him possessed something more valuable than training, or equipment. They possessed the desperate courage of men fighting for their homes and their freedom. As the Continental Army approached Princeton, in the pre-dawn darkness, Washington reflected on the weight of the moment. This would not be remembered as one of the war's great battles. It was too small, too brief, involving too few men. But sometimes the smallest actions create the largest consequences. And Washington sensed that this frigid January morning would either mark the beginning of American victory or the end of American hope. The die was cast, and there could be no turning back. In a few hours, the world would know whether the United States of America would survive to see its first birthday. The first rays of sunlight broke through the winter clouds as Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood rode out from Princeton with his column of British regulars. He had received word that American forces were moving in the area, but intelligence suggested they were retreating toward Pennsylvania. Mawhood, a veteran of European campaigns, intended to link up with British forces at Trenton and crush whatever remained of Washington's ragtag army. Neither commander realized they were about to stumble into one of history's most consequential meeting engagements. The Princeton Battlefield Society notes that this battle proved American forces could stand against British regulars in open combat, a crucial psychological breakthrough that would reshape the entire conflict. Mawhood's confidence reflected the typical British attitude toward colonial soldiers. They were undisciplined rabble who scattered at the first sight of professional soldiers. This morning would shatter that assumption forever. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, advance elements of both armies spotted each other near the William Clark Farm, southeast of Princeton. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, later described the moment as electric with possibility and terror. The Americans had been marching for hours through bitter cold, their weapons frost-covered, their stomachs empty. Yet when they saw the red coats of British infantry forming battle lines, Something extraordinary happened. They did not run. Mahud immediately recognized the gravity of his situation. Instead of facing a retreating rabble, he confronted an organized army advancing in military formation. These Americans moved with purpose, their officers barking commands, their artillery being wheeled into position. The British colonel made a fateful decision. Rather than retreat to the safety of Princeton's buildings, he would meet the Americans in open battle and destroy them through superior training and discipline. The opening volleys erupted across the frozen fields with thunderous intensity. British muskets, maintained by professional soldiers and loaded with practiced precision, sent deadly lead balls whistling toward American lines. The Continental soldiers, many fighting in their first major engagement, wavered under the disciplined fire. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that British training would triumph over American determination. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the American vanguard, fell mortally wounded as British bayonets charged his position. His men began to give ground, and Mahud sensed victory within his grasp. British officers shouted encouragement to their soldiers, urging them to press the attack and scatter the rebels once and for all. The psychological moment had arrived. Would the Americans break and run, confirming British assumptions about colonial cowardice, or would they stand and fight like soldiers? Washington himself provided the answer, spurring his horse directly. Between the opposing battle lines, the commanding general rallied his wavering troops through personal example rather than mere words. Enemy bullets whistled past his head, and his officers screamed at him to seek cover, but Washington remained, exposed, a towering figure of defiance against the British advance. His soldiers, seeing their commander's courage, found their own. The tide of battle shifted in that crucial moment. American artillery, commanded by young Captain Hamilton, began finding its range, sending cannonballs crashing through British ranks. The Continental infantry, inspired by Washington's presence, reformed their lines and delivered devastating volleys into the advancing redcoats. Mahud's disciplined advance suddenly became a desperate struggle for survival. The transformation that occurred on Princeton's battlefield defied every military manual written in Europe. Professional soldiers were supposed to defeat militia. Trained regulars were supposed to scatter colonial farmers. Yet as the morning progressed, something unprecedented unfolded in the frozen fields of New Jersey. American amateurs were out fighting British professionals, and both sides knew it. Mahud's 17th Foot Regiment, veterans of campaigns across the British Empire, found themselves being systematically destroyed by men they had dismissed as rabble. The Americans fought with a ferocity that shocked. The British officers, who had expected their enemies to flee at the first sight of bayonets, instead, Continental soldiers stood their ground, reloaded under fire, and advanced against seasoned troops with a determination that bordered on the supernatural. The key to American success lay not in superior training or equipment, but in superior motivation. British soldiers fought for king and country, abstract concepts that meant little to men thousands of miles from home. American soldiers fought for their farms, their families, and their freedom, tangible realities that gave them strength beyond their military experience. When a British bayonet charge threatened to break their line, they thought of their wives and children and held firm. Captain Hamilton's artillery proved decisive in ways that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Every cannonball that found its mark among British ranks sent a message to observers throughout the colonies: American forces could meet British regulars in conventional battle and emerge victorious. This was not guerrilla warfare or irregular tactics. This was soldiers fighting soldiers, and the Americans were winning. The British found themselves caught in a tactical nightmare. Their training emphasized disciplined volleys and bayonet charges, tactics that had proven successful against European armies. But the Americans fought with a flexibility born of desperation, adapting to circumstances rather than following rigid doctrine. When British infantry advanced, American artillery cut them down. When British cavalry threatened, American infantry formed squares. When British officers fell, American sergeants assumed command and continued the fight. Mahud realized his position was becoming untenable. His casualties mounted with each passing minute, and American reinforcements continued arriving on the battlefield. The psychological impact was perhaps even more damaging than the physical losses. His soldiers were discovering that Americans could fight, and that realization shook their confidence in British invincibility. The moment of decision arrived when Washington personally led a charge against the British center. The sight of the American commander-in-chief, sword in hand, galloping directly at British bayonets, electrified his soldiers and terrified his enemies. This was not the action of a desperate rebel leader. This was the behavior of a warrior who knew he was going to win. British resistance collapsed with stunning suddenness. Soldiers who had held their ground for hours suddenly broke and ran, abandoning their wounded and their equipment in their haste to escape. Mahood, seeing his command disintegrating, ordered a general retreat toward Princeton, hoping to make a stand among the town's buildings. But the Americans were not finished.
Always.
Energized by their success and sensing complete victory within their grasp, they pursued the fleeing British with a savagery that shocked even veteran soldiers. This was not the controlled advance of a disciplined army. This was the charge of men who had tasted victory for the first time in months and would not be denied. The pursuit through Princeton's streets transformed from military engagement into something approaching a rout. British soldiers, their morale shattered by the defeat in the open fields, found themselves hunted through narrow lanes by Americans, who fought with the desperation of men who knew this might be their only chance for victory. The neat rows of houses and shops became a maze where every corner might hide death, and every doorway could conceal an enemy. Mahood attempted to rally his men around Nassau Hall, the imposing stone building that housed the College of New Jersey. The structure offered excellent defensive positions, with thick walls that could stop musket balls and upper floors that provided commanding fields of fire. For a brief moment, it appeared that British training and discipline might yet salvage something from the disaster unfolding in the streets below. American artillery, however, had followed the infantry into town. Captain Hamilton, his guns smoking from the battlefield engagement, unlimbered his cannons in the streets and prepared to blast the British from their stone fortress. The psychological impact was immediate. British soldiers who had sought refuge in Nassau Hall suddenly realized that their sanctuary had become a trap. Stone walls that could stop musket balls offered no protection against artillery. The bombardment of Nassau Hall lasted only minutes, but its effects resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. When American cannonballs crashed through the building's windows, shattering not only glass, but also British confidence, they announced to the world that this colonial rebellion possessed real military capability. These were not desperate farmers with hunting rifles. These were soldiers with artillery, organization, and the will to use both effectively. British resistance crumbled entirely when Mahood realized that his position was hopeless, surrounded by American forces, with his escape routes blocked and his defensive positions under bombardment. The British colonel made the decision that probably saved his remaining men's lives. He ordered surrender. The sight of British soldiers laying down their arms before American militia sent shockwaves through both armies. The capture of Princeton's British garrison provided Washington with more than just military supplies and prisoners. It demonstrated to his own soldiers that they could defeat professional European troops in conventional warfare, a realization that transformed their self-perception from desperate rebels to legitimate soldiers. The psychological transformation would prove more valuable than any material gains from the victory. Washington, however, understood that his triumph remained incomplete. British forces at New Brunswick still posed a significant threat, and General Cornwallis was reportedly marching north with reinforcements. The Americans had won a battle, but the war's outcome still hung in the balance. The question now was whether they could exploit their success, or whether British professionalism would ultimately prevail. The aftermath of the street fighting revealed the true scope of American success. British casualties far exceeded American losses, with 40 Continental soldiers killed compared to 275 British dead and wounded. More importantly, the Americans had captured supplies, weapons, and prisoners that would sustain their cause through the difficult winter months. Ahead, as Washington surveyed the captured town, he recognized that this small engagement had achieved something far more significant than military victory. It had proved that American independence was not merely a political aspiration, but a military reality. His soldiers had met British regulars in open combat and emerged triumphant, an achievement that would resonate throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic. The news of Princeton's fall spread through the colonies like wildfire, igniting a revolution in American morale that proved more decisive than the battle itself. Riders galloped along post roads carrying reports that seemed almost too good to believe. Washington's army had not only survived its winter crisis, but had struck 2 devastating blows against British forces in less than a week. The psychological impact transformed the entire character of the American Revolution. Colonial newspapers, which had spent months reporting British victories and American retreats, suddenly had a different story to tell. The Pennsylvania Evening Post proclaimed the victory as proof that American arms can triumph over the finest troops in Europe, while the Boston Gazette declared that the tide of war has turned in favor of liberty. These were not mere propaganda statements. They reflected a genuine shift in colonial confidence that would have profound strategic implications. British reaction proved equally significant, though in ways that favored American interests. General William Howe, commanding British forces in North America, found himself forced to reconsider his entire strategy for crushing the rebellion. The easy victories he had expected were proving elusive. His professional soldiers were discovering that American rabble could fight effectively when properly led and motivated. The European response carried even greater long-term consequences. French observers, already intrigued by the possibility of weakening their British rivals, saw Princeton as evidence that American forces could sustain military operations against professional European armies. This assessment would eventually lead to French military and financial support that proved crucial to American victory. But even in January 1777, the battle's diplomatic implications were becoming apparent. Washington's strategic position improved dramatically in the weeks following Princeton. New Jersey militia, emboldened by American success, began harassing British outposts throughout the region. What had been occupied territory under British control gradually became contested ground where American forces could operate effectively. The geography of the war was shifting in favor of the Revolution. More importantly, Continental Army enlistments began increasing for the first time in months. Men who had watched Washington's retreat across New Jersey with despair now saw the Continental Army as a legitimate military force capable of achieving victory. The crisis of confidence that had threatened to destroy the Revolution in December 1776 was replaced by a renewed determination to continue the struggle for independence. The British found themselves confronting a fundamentally different strategic situation. Instead of crushing a failing rebellion through overwhelming force, they now faced a resilient enemy capable of conventional military operations. Their comfortable winter quarters in New Jersey became exposed positions vulnerable to American attack, forcing them to concentrate forces and abandon much of the territory they had conquered. Princeton's impact on American military development proved equally profound. Officers who had questioned Washington's leadership now saw him as a commander capable of achieving victory. Against professional soldiers, the Continental Army began developing the institutional confidence necessary for sustained military operations, psychological transformation that would prove essential in the long campaigns ahead. Perhaps most significantly, Princeton demonstrated that American independence was militarily achievable. The victory proved that colonial forces could meet British regulars in conventional battle and emerge triumphant, destroying the myth of British invincibility that had haunted American morale since the war's beginning. This realization would sustain American efforts through years of difficult campaigning that lay ahead. The weeks following Princeton revealed the battle's true strategic significance as British forces throughout New Jersey found their positions becoming untenable. What had seemed like conquered territory suddenly became hostile ground, where American militia operated with impunity, attacking supply convoys, harassing outposts, making British occupation a costly and dangerous endeavor. The entire strategic balance in the Middle Colonies had shifted overnight. General Cornwallis, arriving too late to prevent the Princeton disaster, faced an impossible situation. His forces could not safely disperse into winter quarters because of American guerrilla activity, yet concentrating them left vast areas of New Jersey under de facto American control. The comfortable British assumption that colonial resistance would collapse during the winter months had proved catastrophically wrong. The intelligence networks that supported both armies underwent dramatic changes in the aftermath of Princeton. New Jersey civilians who had remained neutral or even supported British forces began providing information to American commanders. Recognizing that the Continental Army represented a genuine threat to British occupation, this intelligence proved invaluable as Washington's forces planned further operations against exposed British positions. Supply situations also reflected the battle's broader impact. British forces, previously able to forage freely throughout New Jersey, found themselves increasingly dependent on supplies transported from New York under heavy guard. American control of the countryside made British logistics significantly more difficult and expensive, forcing them to divert combat troops to protect supply lines. The transformation of American military capabilities accelerated following Princeton's success. Continental officers who had learned valuable lessons about conventional warfare began training their men more effectively. Incorporating tactical innovations learned through combat experience, amateur army that had fled across New Jersey in December was becoming a professional military force capable of sustained operations. International observers took careful note of these developments. European military experts who had dismissed American forces as ineffective militia began reassessing their conclusions. Recognizing that the Continental Army possessed genuine military potential, these assessments would influence foreign policy decisions that ultimately determined the war's outcome. Though their full impact would not become apparent for months, Washington himself recognized that Princeton had created opportunities that must be exploited quickly before British forces could recover and adapt. His subsequent operations throughout the winter and spring of 1777 reflected a new confidence in his army's capabilities and a strategic vision that extended far beyond mere survival. The defensive war was becoming an offensive campaign. The psychological warfare dimension proved equally important. British soldiers throughout North America learned that American forces could defeat them in conventional combat, a realization that undermined morale and military effectiveness. Conversely, American soldiers gained confidence that sustained them through subsequent campaigns, where victory was far from certain. Colonial governments that had wavered in their support for independence found their resolve strengthened by evidence that American forces could achieve military success. State militias that had been reluctant to support continental operations began cooperating more effectively, providing intelligence, supplies, and reinforcements that enhanced American military capabilities throughout the region. Perhaps most significantly, Princeton demonstrated that the American Revolution had evolved beyond a political rebellion into a genuine war of independence, backed by effective military force. This transformation would prove decisive in determining the conflict's ultimate outcome. History has relegated the Battle of Princeton to footnote status, overshadowed by more famous engagements like Saratoga and Yorktown, yet its impact on the American Revolution's ultimate success cannot be overstated. This small engagement in the frozen fields of New Jersey accomplished something that larger battles failed to achieve, proved that American independence was not merely a political aspiration, but a military reality that could be sustained. Through effective combat operations, the battle's immediate tactical results, British casualties, captured supplies, improved American morale, were significant but temporary. Its strategic consequences proved far more enduring, fundamentally altering the character of the conflict and the capabilities of both armies. British forces never again enjoyed the psychological advantage they had possessed before Princeton, while American forces gained a confidence that sustained them through years of difficult campaigning. Washington's personal reputation underwent a dramatic transformation following Princeton's success. Officers who had questioned his military competence now recognized him as a commander, capable of achieving victory against professional soldiers under the most challenging circumstances. His confidence in Washington's leadership proved essential. During subsequent crises, when lesser commanders might have lost the support of their subordinates, the battle's influence on American military development extended far beyond the immediate participants. Officers throughout the Continental Army learned valuable lessons about conventional warfare, tactical innovation, and the importance of maintaining morale under adverse conditions. These lessons, applied in subsequent campaigns, gradually transformed an amateur militia into a professional army capable of defeating the world's most powerful military force. European recognition of American military capability traced directly to Princeton's demonstration that colonial forces could meet British regulars in open combat and emerge victorious. French military advisors who had been skeptical of American potential became advocates for providing support to the revolution, ultimately leading to the alliance that proved decisive in achieving independence. The domestic impact within the American colonies proved equally profound. Citizens who had wavered between loyalty and rebellion saw Princeton as evidence that independence was achievable. Strengthening popular support for the revolution when it was most needed, state governments that had been reluctant to support continental operations began providing resources and manpower that enhanced American military effectiveness. Princeton's tactical innovations influenced military doctrine throughout the 18th century. The successful integration of artillery with infantry attacks, the effective use of militia in conventional operations, and the psychological impact of aggressive leadership became standard elements of American military practice. European observers studied these innovations and incorporated them into their own military systems. Perhaps most importantly, Princeton demonstrated that seemingly minor engagements can have major historical consequences. The battle involved fewer than 5,000 soldiers, lasted only a few hours, and resulted in relatively modest casualties. Yet its impact on the revolution's ultimate success was enormous. Military historians continue to study this phenomenon, recognizing that tactical victories can produce strategic transformations that alter the course of history. The men who fought at Princeton on that frigid January morning could not have imagined the long-term consequences of their actions. They fought for immediate survival, for their comrades, and for their families. Yet their courage in that moment helped secure American independence and establish the United States as a sovereign nation. Their sacrifice, largely forgotten by subsequent generations, deserves recognition as one of the revolution's most decisive moments. Today, visitors to Princeton battlefield can walk the grounds where this transformation occurred, though few recognize the profound historical significance of what happened there on January 3, 1777. The battle that saved the American Revolution remains underrated, overshadowed by more famous engagements, yet its impact on the course of human freedom cannot be denied.